So I'm going to act out something. I'm not a great mime, but I'm going to do it anyway in hopes that you can figure out what it is. And I will say, if Jack and Rose can get this, that means you've been thoroughly Americanized. So we shall see. But I bet some of you, if not all of you, will get it. And forgive me ahead of time for my poor miming skills.
Oh, look, a seagull.
I know Babe Ruth used to do that.
Okay. Okay. So what was that done very poorly? Are you doing? Take me out to the ball. There we go. 2 strikes and a home run. But what famous thing was I enacting? Babe Ruth. That's right. Calling his shot. 1932 World Series against the hated Chicago Cubs. Babe's first time up, he hit a home run, and the Cub fans were just after him and being very mouthy, as Chicago people can be, as we know. And legend has it that after taking 2 strikes, swinging and missing, Babe pointed to left center field and then proceeded to hit a home run there. There's a problem, though. Anyone guess what it is? It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Even though, are you aware of that story? Yes. Yeah, it's part of the American baseball mythology. Jack and Rose, have you heard that? Have you officially become Americans? Have you heard that story before? Maybe a little bit. Okay. So, I know you're officially Americans and all that stuff. So, but it didn't happen. He did hit 2 home runs, one in the first, one in the 5th inning. But here's what Babe Ruth himself said about it a year later. A sports writer said, tell us about calling your shot. Did you do that? And this is Babe Ruth, quoting him exactly. He had a typical, colorful language of baseball players. Babe Ruth said, hell no. It isn't a fact. Only a damned fool would have done a thing like that. There was that second strike, and they let me have it again, and them is like all the jawing from the dugouts and all the Chicago people, let me have it again. So I held up that finger again, and I said, I still have 1 strike left. So he did hold up a finger. Now, kid, you know damn well I wasn't pointing anywhere. If I had done that, Root, the pitcher, would have stuck that ball right in my ear. And that's true today, too. If a batter showboats too much, a pitcher will, come inside, as they say. I never knew anybody anyway who could tell you ahead of time where he was going to hit a baseball. So we have this famous American myth, and it persists. I bet if we did a poll, just went out, especially in New York, but across the country, people of a certain age, there were some teenagers over at Bellevue First, some grandsons, and they knew who Babe Ruth was, but they had never heard this story. But people of a certain generation, of which I'm included, we heard this story growing up. Even if it's not true, why does this legend persist, I ask you? Because we want it to exist. Because Babe Ruth was larger than life. He was this big, towering figure, not just in baseball, but in American culture. And it just seemed right that he would do something bigger than life. And so even when Babe Ruth himself said, no, I didn't do that, the legend lived on. Because it tells us something about Babe Ruth. That he was big, that he was grand, that he was larger than life. Now, this is true of the book of Exodus as well. I'm going to maybe burst somebody's bubble this morning. and I don't mean to. Hopefully I don't send somebody into a crisis of faith. But this Exodus story that we've all been raised with, where Moses went and said, let my people go, and Pharaoh said no, and so Moses said, God, can you send some plagues to encourage Pharaoh? And eventually Pharaoh said, enough, I'm going to let these people go. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. There's no record of it anywhere. Start with the Egyptians. The Egyptians were fanatical record keepers. Fanatical. We know the barley harvest from small towns and small areas in Egypt year by year for thousands of years. They were fanatical record keepers. You probably have somebody like that in your life. Over at Bellevue First, there's Darlene Hamilton that some of you have gotten to know. She's a former librarian. She takes notes on everything. Everything. And it's great. She takes minutes of all the meetings, but even when we're in like a small discussion group, she's just writing down everything everyone says, which is great. The Egyptians were like a whole culture of Darlene Hamiltons. They wrote down everything, and in all their records, how many references to the plagues? 0. How many references to, does anyone know about how many Israelites would have left Egypt? Close to 500,000, 500,000 or so. Big deal, right? There's no record of that anywhere. Now, before I was a pastor, after I was a zookeeper, I was an archaeologist. People leave stuff everywhere. People just leave stuff. If we excavated around this church, what do you think we would find? Stuff that had been dropped here over the years. There's probably some ancient Easter eggs that are still tucked under some bushes. I mean, it's just somebody's car keys are invariably buried in a yard somewhere around here. When you've got 500,000 people, they drop a lot of stuff. Not to mention, if you've got 500,000 people trucking around in a desert for 40 years, how on earth do you feed that many people? Or find enough? Like, we kind of always knew that something about this doesn't sit right. And again, I hope I'm not causing anyone to have a crisis of faith. Pardon? Where are the porta potties? That's right, right. And if you really think about it, it's kind of a relief that the book of Exodus may not be a factual account of what happened for a couple reasons. The first is that we know, because the Egyptians were fabulous record keepers, that the Israelites were not the only ones in captivity. There were a lot of other peoples who were taken captive by Egyptians. But the only one we have record of in Exodus of being liberated was the Israelites. So does that mean that on their way out, they were just like, good luck, everyone who's not us. Sorry that you're still enslaved, but we're out of here. Or shouldn't they have said, all you slaved peoples, come with us? But we don't have any record of that. So that's problematic. But we also have the most troubling thing that is kind of a relief if this is not a factual account, and it is what happened to the firstborn male children in Egypt. Anyone recall? Nobody wants to say it out loud. What happened?
They were murdered.
They were murdered. They were slaughtered. That's right. Is anyone here really comfortable worshiping a God who would be okay with doing that? Like, I'm not sure that's a God that any of us want to cozy up to. Oh, sure, I'll just send the angel of death through this entire land, killing firstborn children. So in some ways, the knowledge that this is not a factual account is a relief and a gift. But it doesn't mean, I'm not advising you to look in the pews or rush home and grab your Bible and open it to the book of Exodus and just rip the chapters out. Don't do that, because there's a point to it. And it's the same reason that that story about Babe Ruth still exists. And it's that something doesn't have to always be factual to tell a truth. Now, there's a story about my recently deceased father that my dad was a hard man. He was raised in Steeltown, Pittsburgh. Probably had more fist fights than he could ever count. Grew up fighting. He was from a culture that it wasn't good for men to be emotional or soft. You just got a job in the steel industry and you worked it, and that's just what you did. Come to find out, my dad was deeply depressed and anxious for most of his life, which is why he drank so much. Eventually, he got sober. And it was during his sober years that this story came out. And the story is that he came home with a matchbook. And I think I may have shared this story once. With, an old-fashioned where you had the wooden matches in it. And he came home with it, and we're like, well, that's a funny thing for you to walk in the house within your hand. And he opened it up, and there was a ladybug in there. Again, we're like, all right, this is kind of strange that he would. And we were like, well, what are you doing with that? And he said, well, there was a spider in the corner of my office, and the ladybug had gotten stuck in the spider's web, and I couldn't stand to just leave it there. So I rescued the ladybug and brought it home to put in the garden. Now, I don't know if that's a true story. I don't know if that's a factual story. But when my dad got sober, he got in touch with his emotions again. And so even if it's not a factual story, it tells a truth about my father, which was when he got sober, he got sensitive in a really, really important and good way that allowed my relationship with him, our relationship, to get a new start, and him to have a strong relationship with his granddaughters and grandson. Exodus is like that story. It may not be factual, but it tells us a truth about it. And it tells us about God, most importantly. And what it tells us is that God desires people to be free, first and foremost. That God wasn't okay with people being enslaved. God desires the liberation of the captives. But what it's also saying is that in the struggle between the powerful and the powerless, God is not neutral. Who does God side with? Between the powerful and the powerless in the book of Exodus. The powerless, that's right. Sends prophets to get them out of there, and when they're chased, all of a sudden the waters part. Israelites pass through, and then the waters collapse on the powerful. And I think getting into a debate, either as a faith community or even individually, getting into a debate about, well, is it true? Is it true? Takes our eyes off the ball. Again, a baseball reference. And it kind of sets us up for, a struggle later. Because wouldn't it be lovely when we look at an enslaved people, people under duress? Wouldn't it be lovely if God would just step in and one fell swoop set everyone free? Right? I mean, that would be amazing. That group of people there, you're free. That group of people, all million of you, you're free. Thanks, God. Woo, you did it for us. We don't have to do anything. We just have to sit back and cheer and eat our popcorn. What does liberation look like in the New Testament, however? What does liberation look like in the days of Jesus? Do we ever have a story of him going to a large group of people, 50 people, 1,000 people, 500,000 people, and saying, you are all now liberated and free? He never does. Never does. In fact, that's part of the confusion of the disciples, right? They keep waiting for him to do something grand, something like on a big stage. But instead, he goes and sits down with a woman at the well and spends time with her. And that's a liberation story, isn't it? What is she liberated from? Her past? Society's understanding of who she is? Her own understanding of who she is? Jesus was absolutely liberating people. In fact, you almost can't look at anything that he does without saying, that's a liberation, and that's a liberation, and that's a liberation. Sometimes he set people free from diseases and deformities that kept them from being accepted in society. Sometimes he set them free from roles in which society shunned them. Sometimes he set them free from their own problematic understandings of themselves. But without fail, he was there about liberating, but it was always one-on-one, right? What does that mean for us gathered here today? Today we are finishing up our month talking about diversity. One of those timely little coincidences or God things where we happen to be talking about the importance of diversity in a time where diversity efforts seem to be under attack. For the potential new congregation that might be birthed in 1 week and half an hour. Does anyone recall the very first word of the new vision statement for that congregation? Inclusion. That's right. When the Vital Merger team was working on the vision, for a while we had the word welcome in there, welcoming. And then we started to realize that welcome was not nearly strong enough. That every church is welcoming in its own way. It's pretty rare that they grab you by your collar and throw you out. But being included means something. Because how Jesus liberated people happened in a very specific way, and it's fascinating. It was by inviting them into a different way of life. It was inviting them into a new and different kind of community where they were seen and valued and loved for who they were. Part of the liberation was healing often. But what really set them free was them having the ability now to be in a community, to re-enter society, to exist in a place where people didn't look at them and say, they're a woman, lesser than. They're missing a finger. That was the vehicle for liberation for Jesus. It was community. But a community that was different, that rejected the cultures and norms of the day in a way that got them all in big trouble, right? Jesus saw the vehicle for liberation being this. A group of wonderful and messy and flawed and hopeful people who will gather in the spirit of love and grace to say, this is important. This is how the world is saved. This is how lives are saved. It is by creating space for each other, including each other. And think about how remarkable that is. I'm going off script a little bit, but both of these churches, it's not an untruth to say that our average age is a little higher, right? How many places exist in our cultures that not just tolerate older adults, but welcome and celebrate older adults? In our culture, now there are some cultures on earth where those with the gift of years are celebrated and venerated, but certainly not ours. How remarkable is it that we could be a place where that is celebrated? We have Lawrence and Nicole and Kayla. How many places are created around neurodivergence? And it's actually one of the hopes for the new church that I have, is that we do a much better job at that, to move from welcoming to inclusion. Jesus liberated people by inviting them into a different way of life, and a different community where all are seen and known and valued and loved for exactly who they are. He opened a door. He drew the circle wide. And he said, here in this place of grace and love, there is room for you here. That is how he changed the world. That is how he saved lives. And that is how we will change the world and save lives as well. And so in God's grace, for today and tomorrow, may it be so. And amen. As we prepare to pray, we're going to sing You Are Mine.